This presentation will focus on the 5-year plans in the Soviet Union created by Joseph Stalin based on the ideas of socialism, which concentrated on developing heavy industry and collectivizing agriculture. Here I've listed the readings that I used to research the presentation. Hunter discusses the first 5-year plan and why it was unachievable to reach such overambitious targets in just 5 years. He makes quantitative comparisons between intentions and various hypothetical alternatives and relate both to actual developments. In turn, this provides a new basis for evaluating the factors that led to the plan's over-ambitiousness. Wyjansky provides a comprehensive look at the plan and approaches the scheme through an empirical lens, which is useful as it provides valuable figures on productivity and labour force during the said years. Lastly, Bogovich provides useful critique of the plans which allow for a more holistic understanding of the scheme. In addition, his work also has useful tables and charts which I employ in the presentation for analytical purposes. Before the plans began, the Soviet Union had been facing threats from external sources, as well as experiencing an economic and industrial downturn since the introduction of Bolshevik rule. The Soviet Union was decades behind most of the major powers, and they needed to quickly play catch-up to bring them up to par with the industrial capacity of Western democracies. When the first 5-year plan began, the USSR was fifth in industrialization. Stalin hoped to transition the Soviet Union from a weak, poorly controlled agricultural state into an industrial powerhouse. While the vision was grand, its planning was ineffective and unrealistic given the short amount of time to meet the desired goal. Overall, there were 13 5-year plans which took place from 1928 till the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. However, this presentation will only focus on the first and the fourth, as the first 5-year plan provides a great foundation for Soviet history, and the fourth 5-year plan because it focuses on the industrialization efforts in the post-Second World War period, which brings us into the timeline of this course. The first 5-year plan called for transforming Soviet agriculture from predominantly individual farms into a system of large state collective farms. The communist regime believed that collectivization would improve agricultural productivity and would produce grain reserves sufficiently large to feed the growing urban labor force. The anticipated surplus was to pay for industrialization. Collectivization hoped to unite privately owned farmers into state collective farms called kolkhoz. The Soviet leadership argued that collective farms would be more effective and produce a surplus, which would feed industrial workers and fund vast industrialization projects by exporting grain abroad. However, in 1932, the government's quota on crops was raised significantly, and farmers were expected to harvest more than before, and for many, it was a target that was impossible to meet. What grain they produced was confiscated, with nothing left for them or their families. Farmers who hoarded their crops were often punished or executed. This directly led to the Soviet famine of 1932. The exact number of people who died in the famine is still unknown, but is estimated to be around 6 to 7 million. The major contributing factors to the famine include forced collectivization of agriculture as part of the Soviet first 5-year plan, combined with rapid industrialization, a decrease in agricultural workforce, and several bad droughts. Furthermore, Stalin placed focus on heavy industry and was determined to make the USSR a leading industrial power, building railroads, industrial complexes, and increasing oil, coal, and steel production. All industry and services were nationalized. Managers were given predetermined output quotas by central planners, and trade unions were converted into mechanisms for increasing worker productivity. Many new industrial centers were developed, particularly in the Ural Mountains, and thousands of new plants were built throughout the country. However, after the Second World War, most industries were destroyed. The USSR lost nearly 100,000 collective farms, 5 million homes, and over 17 million cattle. Railways, roads, and bridges were also destroyed. Retreating German armies stripped industrial equipment and farming produce from the USSR. So another 5-year plan introduced was necessary to reconstruct the vital industries. The first post-war plan, which took place from 1945 to 1950, restored almost all branches to their pre-war levels, with most resources going to those with the greater war damage. Like earlier plans, the fourth 5 year plan stressed heavy industry and transportation. The main features of the fourth 5 year plan were to reconvert wartime factories back to civilian production, to reconstruct large scale industrial plants that had been destroyed, to ensure that the economy was in constant state of readiness for war, and to restore the economy to pre war levels. As we can see here, the economy met most of the targets in heavy industry. By 1950, industrial production was 75% higher than in 1940. Metal and heavy engineering was particularly successful. Some of the big prestige projects of the 1930s that had been destroyed were rebuilt, and industry productivity saw a slight increase after the war. In the second table, the goal for coal and oil were fulfilled, and steel production showed an increase of 49% by 1950. Coal output also climbed 57% over 1940 and overfulfilled by 4%. So as we can see here, most of the goals stated were fulfilled, which is positive, especially compared to previous years, which is partly due to the fact that the period was during war recovery, when forecasts tend to be on the low side anyway. Now that we've looked at the 5 year plans, it leaves us with the question of whether it was a success or a failure. In some ways, it was a success as it led to large increases of output that could double the number of workers in industry. And the industrial growth also mustn't be understated, as they made massive strides in several different industries that allowed the Soviet to become an economic and industrial superpower by the mid 20th century, with them being behind only the US. Without this, the Soviet would probably never have been technologically advanced enough to defeat Nazi Germany in World War II. However, the increase of agriculture and industrial production came at the expense of consumer goods, as many of what was produced during this time were of such low quality that they could never be used and as a result were wasted. There were also shortages in luxury products and at times in necessities. Moreover, there were also great failures during the first 5 year plan because of the unrealistic quotas set for industrialization that in reality will not be met for decades to come. Quotas expecting to reach 300% output and labour to increase by 110% were unrealistic in the time frame they were allotted for. However, after the 1940s, the goals were much more realistic, but while industrial workers were meeting the quotas, the quality of the products being produced was substandard. Furthermore, as I discussed earlier, there was a widespread resistance from farmers over the forced collectivization scheme. In order to combat this, Stalin forced many people to live in communal housing where many necessities were not present in their homes. Many people were left with no home, therefore were forced onto the street, which resulted in high crime rates, and with the absence of food and exceeding poor sanitation, many of the homeless died. Stalin dealt with those who opposed him by killing or deporting them. This caused a famine which resulted in millions of deaths. To conclude, the 5 year plan was an attempt by the Soviet Union to catch up industrially with their Western competitors by rapidly developing industries like coal and iron, power supplies, and transport. There was a mixture of successes and failures. Stalin managed to modernize the industry by means of the 5 year plan. With that, he achieved significant success, but that came at the cost of human lives.